I thought I would just kind of explain briefly the partnership that Zero Breast Cancer has had with Dominican University. Back in 2008, we partnered with them to put on a conference called, what was it called? The Promise of Stem Cells in Human Health. And as a result of that experience, I think we all experienced the richness that comes from bringing together students and faculty and community members, as well as scientists from different disciplines, to bring them together and to engage in a dialogue that on a health topic that is of incredible importance. So I wanted to say that I think, having a university, having Dominican University right here in the middle of our Marin community is such a valuable resource to all of us, individuals and organizations, and that we should be very proud of it being here. So that said, I want to thank all of you for being here for the first installation of the Spring 2010 Lecture Series at Dominican University. Our guest tonight, Dr. Atul Gawande, is a renowned surgeon at Brigham and Womens Hospital in Boston. He's an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and the Harvard School of Public Health, and he's also an author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, which are back there, one called Better and one called Complications. And he also, I think as most people in just listening to snippets of conversation, he is a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine. In his inspiring and insightful new book, The Checklist Manifesto, How to Get Things Right, Dr. Gawande attempts to make our lives simpler. In this complex, high-tech world, he takes a logical and a safe shopping list approach and applies it to checklists in a fascinating self-improvement book. He gives a wide range of examples and explains and supports how checklists can work for all of us from all different walks of life. Dr. Gawande insists that with more discipline, organization, and better communication, individuals and companies can utilize checklists to reduce errors and to be more productive and effective. The bottom line is Dr. Gawande is trying to make our lives less stressful than they already are. So please sit back and relax. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Atul Gawande.
Thanks for bringing me here tonight and for all of you coming out to have me try to explain why in the world I would write a book on checklists of all things, least of all as a surgeon. And I want to start with a case that intrigued me to try to begin to explain this. In 1999, there was a surgical study published in one of our journals that outlined how to deal with, how to manage cases where someone has drowned. And it outlined it around the case of a 3-year-old girl. The girl, this was in Austria because the authors who had developed the understanding of what to do in these cases were in the mountains in the Alps in Austria. And they had a case come to them, a 3-year-old girl who had fallen into an icy fish pond while out on a walk with her parents. It was one of those nightmares where the parents saw her fall in and then go under the water, and the parents jumped in after her, but lost her and couldn't get her out. For 30 minutes they searched, and only then did they find her on the pond bottom, pulled her to the surface, and brought her to the shore. Of course, after 30 minutes, she wasn't breathing. They called the emergency services line and got an operator who explained to them how to do CPR. 8 minutes later, the first emergency team, the rescue team, arrived on the site and took the first vital signs. Her temperature was 66 degrees. Her pulse was absent. She had no breaths, and most ominously, her pupils were dilated and did not react to light, meaning her brain was gone. But no one gives up on a little girl, and so they continued the CPR, brought her by helicopter to the nearest hospital. At the hospital, they bypassed the emergency room and went straight to the operating room, and then the team put her on cardiopulmonary bypass. That's no small matter. You have to cut down over the groin, expose the femoral artery and vein, plug in inflow and outflow lines, prime the pump, and only then are you restoring circulation. The whole process took long enough that it was more than an hour and a half from the time she had last breathed. After 2 hours, they were able to warm her body up 10 degrees, and her heart began to beat. So they went further and warmed her body all the way up to normal, which took about 6 hours to get to 98.6 degrees. At that point, they wanted to try to switch her over to a mechanical lung ventilator, but when they tried to push air and oxygen down through the tube in her throat, they found that her lungs were too full of pond water and debris to allow the oxygen to get through. The cardiopulmonary bypass machine is just a machine made for temporary management during surgery, so they needed to switch to a different device, an extracorporeal membrane oxygenator. It is an artificial lung device, and they brought it into the room, and to hook it up, they needed to now do a sternotomy. They opened her chest, plugged the inflow and outflow lines into the right atrium of her heart and her aorta, and then with that, we're able to have this artificial lung going. They then unplugged the cardiopulmonary bypass, repaired the holes in the femoral vessels, and closed that wound. Then they pulled a sterile drape over her open chest with the tubes and lines going out, wheeled her with the bed and the equipment to the intensive care unit, and then continued to work. They used bronchoscopy to try to suction out the water in her lungs and the debris that was there. And after 24 hours of repetitive effort, they found that her lungs were cleared enough that the oxygen now would go through. And they were able to switch her over to the mechanical ventilator. So it was back downstairs to the operating room, unhook the artificial lung machine, repair the holes in the heart and the aorta, bring the chest back together, bring her back to intensive care, give her medications, fluids, dialysis support. And then over the next 48 hours, the remaining organs slowly came back. Her liver came out of shock. Her kidneys started working again. She could be fed through a feeding tube to her gut. Everything came back except one organ, her brain. She was stable enough now that they took her down to the CT scanner and scanned her brain. They found that her brain had swelled to the limits of her skull. But there were also no dead zones, no obvious area where there had been a stroke from the loss of oxygen. So they decided to keep going. They called a neurosurgery team down that drilled a hole in her skull, threaded a probe into the brain with which they could measure the pressures and adjust their medications and fluids up and down to get it to a safer level. She remained comatose for a week, and then she began to wake up. First, her pupils reacted to light. Then she began to breathe on her own. And then one day, she simply awoke, and she was there. 1 week later, she went home. It wasn't over yet. She was paralyzed on the right side of her body. She had severely slurred speech. She required weekly intensive occupational and physical therapy. And 2 years later, she came back to the clinic for neuropsychological testing, and they found she had completely normal function with the right side of her body and the left side of her body having equal strength. Her speech was normal, and she had progressed developmentally exactly at age. She was 5 years old, and at that point, like any other little girl that you and I know. I was really struck reading this article about what I should do if I have a drowning patient come in. Because, number one, it revealed to us the extent of capability that we have developed, that we could bring a child back from having been without oxygen for this long. But the second thing was, this was not Grey's Anatomy. This was not a few chest compressions and she's going to come coughing and sputtering back to life. This was dozens, even hundreds of people that had to be able to string together all of those steps, one right after the other, without a major error along the way. One person not washing their hands, letting an infection get in underneath that drape with her open chest, and it all would have been over. And there were multiple points along the way that were like this. At this moment of healthcare reform, where we are attempting to cover our population in an effort that has been a century in development, we've also been concerned about what it means for the quality of our health care and whether we can handle the cost of trying to have everybody in our population covered. And after the intense and often angry debate of this past year, we can imagine that the most difficult and important issues in medicine are what the insurance rules are going to be, or whether there's too much government regulation, or what the problems are of our concerns about malpractice lawsuits, or all of our money issues. And all of these things make our jobs difficult as clinicians in medicine. But our deepest struggle remains one that virtually every professional now faces, which is how we deal with the increasing and massive complexity of what our jobs require. Being a doctor used to be something you could manage out of your office in most instances, and if you're a surgeon with a operating room that the hospital would make available to you with a small staff to help manage things. But after the last century of incredible discovery, we have now identified 13,600 different diagnoses that the human body can sustain, 13,600 ways that the human body can fail. And for those, for nearly all of them, we've identified beneficial things that we can do to help people. If not cure disease, then to relieve people's suffering, offer ways to give them a better quality of life. But what's involved are now 6,000 drugs that I can prescribe, 4,000 medical and surgical procedures, and managing to get the right combination at the right time, at the right place, without error, has turned out to be incredibly overwhelming. And doing it without wasting resources, without mistreatment, overtreatment, undertreatment, has brought even our economy to the brink. The situation we're in is one of extreme complexity, and the evidence that we're having trouble being able to manage it come at a frequent basis now. Studies showing, for example, that 40% of coronary disease patients receive incomplete or inappropriate care. 60% of pneumonia patients receiving incomplete or inappropriate care. Or at the simplest level, the fact that we still have trouble making sure we're all washing our hands, with 2 million people picking up infections in hospitals across the country, and 100,000 of them who die from those infections. And then we go beyond medicine, and you see in the most recent numbers in the legal profession that there was a 36% increase in lawsuits against lawyers for legal errors, mostly errors and screw-ups with calendar dates and other kinds of administrative issues. And then also among the most common, simple errors in applying the law. We see the difficulties of complexity in our flawed software design, in our intelligence failures, in tottering banks. The philosophers have pointed out that there are two sources of failure in what we try to do as human beings, two main reasons that things go wrong. Number one is ignorance. We simply don't know everything about how the world works, what will happen, and what to do about it. But the second they called ineptitude, meaning the knowledge exists, but an individual or a group of individuals fail to apply the knowledge correctly. What is both fascinating and disturbing about our time, about our generation, I think, is that ineptitude has become as much or more our struggle as ignorance. We lived for millennia with our problems being primarily ones of ignorance. We didn't understand the illnesses that befell us, let alone what to do about them. And we didn't understand why the natural world behaved the way it did or what ways we really had to manipulate it. And there's still much we don't know. But over the last century in particular, we've accumulated immense amounts of knowledge and information about how things work and what can be done. And so ineptitude has become our new modern struggle, trying to ensure we deliver on that knowledge. Our ambition, in other words, our ambitions to provide health care safely, not just to our whole country's population, but to the world. Our ambitions to ensure terrorists don't get on planes. Our ambitions to make sure we have a complex financial system that works. All of these kinds of ambitions have exceeded the capabilities of our experts. These kinds of failures have a deep emotional valence. We've developed, I think, our population has developed a growing disgust for elites, for the experts, for people like me who claim to know just what to do for them. We had, I think, a different relationship with leaders when the biggest problems were ones of ignorance. We tolerated those who tried to grapple with the mysteries of the world and understood, if they fail, that this is just the way that sometimes things are. But we saw it as a miracle when they succeeded, and we're immensely grateful to them for it. And we were grateful to doctors and others when they would succeed half a century ago or longer. But now that we know so much, and yet fail, we have tremendous intolerance for failures of ineptitude. What do you mean? My mother picked up the infection that is now putting her in the intensive care unit because someone didn't wash their hands. What do you mean 3 pieces of information could have been tied together to keep the bomber off the plane to Detroit, and it didn't go through because people just didn't talk to one another, or because one of the people who took the report from the father reporting that he was worried that his son was going to do something like this failed to get the correct spelling of his name, and therefore never noticed that he was actually on a watch list to begin with. There's a reason that philosophers gave such a pitiless word to these kinds of problems: ineptitude. Now, I, as a surgeon, I said, never thought I'd be writing a book about checklists. But I was assigned a project with the World Health Organization to try to reduce deaths in surgery. You don't put the words surgery and public health together normally, but we have seen an enormous change in the world. As the economies have improved, people are living longer. And around the world, that has meant that they're living past infectious disease to the point that now coronary artery disease is the world's #1 killer. It's no longer diarrheal illness or respiratory disease. And that's true in Asia, in virtually all the world. The one remaining place still with the #1 killer being respiratory illness is sub-Saharan Africa. You have, as a result, road traffic accidents in the top 5 as a killer, cancers in the top 10, and therefore enormous demand for surgery, to the point that we now do 250 million operations a year worldwide. The volume of surgery has exceeded the volume of childbirth, but with death rates 10 to 100 times higher. So although we've gotten very, very good at being able to provide something like surgery, it has also become highly technological, involving whole teams of people, very deep expertise. And when we're doing, like we do in the United States, 50 million operations a year, even as good as we've gotten, it's clear it's not good enough, because doing that many operations, we have 150,000 people who die following surgery per year in the US, 3 to 4 times as many who die following car accidents. And our studies show at least half of those deaths are avoidable with knowledge that currently exists, standards of care that teams simply didn't apply. So the puzzle is, what do we do about that? Our tactics have been super specialization, meaning training people longer and longer. I trained for 8 years to become a surgeon, and in narrower and narrower specialties where you do only a handful of the components of care. I can't handle 4,000 surgical procedures, so I just try to do some of them. And then we also have tried to add technology to make things, in theory, simpler. But it clearly hasn't been enough. In many ways, the technology and specialization has introduced as many difficulties as we find we've solved. And so in this project with the World Health Organization, we began looking around. We looked to how other worlds have dealt with extreme complexity and found many where they were grappling with the problem, but a couple that had actually reached very high levels of success in dealing with deep complexity. One was the airline world, where airplanes have grown increasingly in sophistication and in power and in capability, and yet the safety records have actually gotten better and better with time. And another was the skyscraper building industry, where the complexity of building these towers now that are of massive height involve dozens of specialties, really, subcontractors who know their field incredibly well, but nobody who seems to know everything about the skyscraper. And yet their structural failure rates, their likelihood that anything would go wrong in a way that would lead to a fundamental failure, have gone down enormously. And how did they do it? I went visiting sites, talk about in the book visiting a skyscraper under construction. And what I found was not what I expected. I thought they'd have a special way to handle this technologically. I thought maybe people would be trained in particular ways. Instead, what I found were checklists, the most low-tech kinds of things you could put together. They had learned how to make checklists, though, to specifically handle complexity. The way we make most of our checklists is to list everything that needs to get done, but when that list is so long that no one can actually get through the whole checklist, you begin to have to learn how to manage things that have reached that kind of scale. And from the folks at Boeing, I visited the checklist factory where they make over 100 checklists a year for situations where pilots have may have to pull out a checklist in the middle of a crash of a plane where they only have 3 minutes to deal with the situation, and having a list of 150 things they should think about and check is impossible. And so they focus on making sure you've identified the most critical things that absolutely cannot be missed, and then also how a team of people can have their best shot at communicating, working together, and taking advantage of the brains that are available to make good decisions on the spot. And so we took those lessons and made a 2-minute checklist for surgery. The checks were some dumb stuff. Make sure an antibiotic is given, the most critical way we can help avoid infection. Make sure blood is available for a case that might require blood. But then also some really interestingly complicated things, like make sure everybody in the room has been introduced by name. Because you now are, I typically in an operation have half a dozen, 8, sometimes 10 people that are working together. And with the number of people that come and go, you'd be surprised how often in my heart of hearts I'm saying, now what was his name? Also, it turns out that speaking your name out loud in a room where you're not sure whether you're supposed to have a role there makes you feel like you're suddenly part of things. The medical student who barely feels they belong in the room asked to introduce themselves and say their role. I'm so-and-so, I'm the medical student. It's been shown that they're much more likely to speak up later and say something like, what is that drug that's dripping on the floor? We also asked the teams to have a briefing with the surgeon explaining what the goals are of the operation and how much blood loss the team should be prepared for, how long they expect the operation to take, and anything else they think the team should know. We asked that the anesthesiologist brief the team on their plans for the anesthesia and anything that they think is of concern. The nurse is asked to state their plans, whether your equipment is ready, whether the sterility is the way it should be, and if there's anything else that they have concerns about before proceeding. It's like folding your hands before the meal and making sure we genuinely are on the same page. The idea of having teams successful by having that kind of check in place is about preparing for the unexpected and making sure the most critical things are not forgotten. We implemented it in 8 hospitals. This was a World Health Organization program, so this was all over the world. We implemented it in University of Washington in Seattle, in Toronto, in London, in Auckland, New Zealand, in some of the top hospitals in the world, but then also in a hospital in rural Tanzania, in New Delhi, in an incredibly crushed hospital, in Manila, in Amman, Jordan. And what we found after 8,000 patients and asking the teams to implement the checklists and try to use them the best they could, even when the surgeon sometimes didn't like it. After 8,000 patients, every hospital had a double-digit reduction in their complication rates. The average reduction was 36%. There were 27 fewer deaths in the group who got the checklist than in the group who didn't, a reduction of almost 50%. And all the results were highly statistically significant. The ideas were designed to be a checklist because they're low cost, easy to transmit, and it's been, since we published the results in January last year in the medical literature, it has now gone to 20 countries that are adopting it as a standard of care. In the United States, we're a more fragmented system. We're at about 20% of American hospitals that have adopted it. Although there are some pockets, they've made really a statewide commitment to make these kinds of approaches a regular part of their care. And so Washington State became the first state by the end of last year to have adopted statewide. We are getting there, but at the front line is a struggle against almost the idea of what a checklist represents. We hate them. it seems contrary to what it means to be an expert at something. A checklist is a way of dumbing things down, and that's for other people, is the way it's regarded. Instead of understanding that they can be made in ways that can help even experts achieve better results than they would otherwise achieve. We surveyed the teams after it had been in place about 3 months, and it wasn't easy to necessarily have the teams even consider using them. I was thrown out of operating rooms all over the world. But by the end, 80% of the surgical team said, you know, it wasn't so bad. 80% said it was easy to use, it didn't take too long, it improved their teamwork and communication, and almost 80% said they actually observed it to have caught at least one error in actual care. But think about it, there was a flip side to our survey. There were the 20% who said, this is stupid. I don't think this helps. I think this is a pain in the butt. I think it is not helping our teamwork or communication. And I'm essentially saying, I'm a good surgeon, I'm a good team. We've already doing this stuff, and doing this kind of check is just another piece of paperwork getting in the way. But then we asked them one more question. If you were having an operation, would you want the checklist? 93% said yes. The question of why we find a willingness to use these kinds of approaches. Aviation has had this for 75 years, and why have we been so slow to embrace these ideas in other walks of life? One reason in the medical world we easily point to is that we don't have the financial incentives to necessarily lead people to think this way. We pay everybody as individuals. It's fee-for-service medicine, and the result is that we don't actually encourage people to think as teams and to spend the resources to design these kinds of approaches to work together as a team. We implemented this checklist in my hospital at the Brigham and Womens Hospital in Boston and reached 100% use of the checklist in all of our operations. But it took us 5 months. And our biggest hurdle was we realized when we wanted to get the surgeons, anesthesiologists, and nurses to agree on what it would look like and how that it would be used, that we didn't have regular meetings where the surgeons, anesthesiologists, and nurses talk through how we handle our flow and operations and work on problems like safety or the efficiency of our care. It had to be invented in order to just use a simple checklist, and that took enormous time. Reform is partly about offering a toolkit, some incentives that help lead us to make changes in the way we pay for ourselves so that we are not working against our financial gains, but instead working in concert with the way the financing works. But I think it underestimates what we're up against if we think that just changing the incentives will solve this, because there's something deeper going on. There was a study of venture capitalists by a psychologist looking at how they made a key decision in whether they would invest in entrepreneurs. And the critical decision for a venture capitalist is not whether you find a good idea. There's lots of good ideas. It's whether you have an entrepreneur with that good idea who actually can execute on it, stick with it for years on end through the problems and so on. And the psychologists observed there were different styles for venture capitalists in making these decisions. They ranged from what they called the art critic, who would sit the entrepreneur down, have a conversation and say, you know, I think this is a good guy. We'll give him $10 million. To the opposite extreme, what they called the airline captain approach, a very checklist-driven, systematic way of saying there are a series of checks that we always go through and we refine them based on our previous mistakes, and we are very analytic about the way we handle the key decision for whether to go with this entrepreneur or not. It won't surprise you to know the venture capitalists who had the highest return on investment were the airline captain approach, with an average 80% return compared to the other ones who had less than 35% return. Still good returns, but not anywhere near what the others achieve. And this is a world where money talks. And yet, which do you think was the most popular kinds of approaches? Along the spectrum from art critic to airline captain, art critic by far was the majority of the way people made their decisions. And only 13% took the airline captain approach. I think there's a deeper idea here about why we're resistant to taking the kind of standardized, same way every time approach of making sure you run through checks before you take on something of great complexity or risk. And that's that we believe the joy of work, especially as experts, comes from autonomy, from the freedom to decide whatever it is that you find is the best way to do things. You've trained for many years, you have great experience, you know what you're doing. And yet we find we can make experts better. The reason, I think, is we haven't quite embraced the notion that we are fallible, that the complexity of the world at this point exceeds our capabilities of our brains to hold it all in. And it leads us to have to almost have a different way of thinking of ourselves as people setting out to accomplish things in the world. We have to rethink what it means to be great, which is not just about having that flash moment when you can save the day just by intuition or gut instinct. It is about being prepared for the unexpected. It's about the discipline to make sure that you're ready for whatever may come. The checklist then is a tool and something I go into great length about how they work and how you can make them better for what you need. But there's something deeper that I'm trying to get at in writing about something like this, which is about where we are as a culture and society trying to grapple with the complexity of the world. And as we turn to something like a checklist, what we see is something that is lowly and humble and overlooked, and I think and misunderstood. But when we pay attention to where our weaknesses are, and then pay attention to how something like a checklist works to supplement the failings of our brains and the difficulties teams have in making things come together, what you realize is that an idea like this can be transformative. Under conditions of complexity, our brains are not enough. We will fail. Knowledge has exceeded our capabilities. But with groups of people who can work together and take advantage of multiple brains, preparing, being disciplined, we can do great and ambitious things. I want to finish by reading a little bit about the drowning girl. You never read in the surgery journals about how they pull something off. They just tell you they did cardiopulmonary bypass and then ECMO and then this and then that. But how did they actually pull it off? So I decided to call the lead author of the report, Marcus Thalmann was his name, cardiac surgeon, at this small hospital in Klagenfurt, Austria. Not some medical mecca that pulled this off, but an ordinary community hospital. And I asked him, how had he done this? He told me he'd been working in Klagenfurt for 6 years when the girl came in. She had not been the first person for whom he and his colleagues had tried to revive from cardiac arrest after hypothermia and suffocation. His hospital received between 3 and 5 such patients a year, he estimated, mostly avalanche victims, some of them drowning victims, and a few of them people attempting suicide by taking a drug overdose and then wandering out into the snowy alpine forests to fall unconscious. For a long time, he said, no matter how hard the hospital's medical staff tried, they had no survivors. Most of the victims had been without a pulse and oxygen for too long when they were found, but some, he was convinced, still had a flicker of viability in them, yet he and his colleagues had always failed to sustain it. He took a close look at the case records. Preparation, he determined, was the key difficulty. Success required having an array of people and equipment at the ready, trauma surgeons, a cardiac anesthesiologist, a cardiothoracic surgeon, bioengineering support staff, and so on. Almost routinely, someone or something was missing. He tried the usual surgical approach to remedy this, yelling at everyone. But still, they had no saves. So he and a couple of colleagues decided to try something new. They made a checklist. They gave the checklist and the power to enforce it to the people with the least power in the whole process: the rescue squads and the hospital telephone operator, and walked them through the details. In cases like these, the checklist said, rescue teams should tell the hospital to prepare for possible cardiac bypass and rewarming. They would call whenever possible before they arrived on the scene, as the preparation time could be significant. The telephone operator would then work down a list of people to order to have everything set up and standing by. With the checklist in place, the team had its first success: the rescue of the 3-year-old girl. Not long afterwards, Thalmann left to take a job at a hospital in Vienna. The team, however, has since had at least 2 other such rescues, he said. In one case, a man had been found frozen and pulseless after a suicide attempt. In another, a mother and her 16-year-old daughter were in an accident that sent them and their car through a guardrail, over a cliff, and into a mountain river. The mother died on impact. The daughter was trapped as the car rapidly filled with icy water. She had been in cardiac and respiratory arrest for a prolonged period of time when the rescue team arrived. From that point onward, though, everything moved like clockwork. By the time the rescue team got to her and began CPR, the hospital had been notified. The transport team delivered her in minutes. The surgical team took her straight to the operating room and crashed her onto heart-lung bypass. One step followed right after another, and because of the speed with which they did, she had a chance. As the girl's body slowly rewarmed, her heart came back. In the ICU, a mechanical ventilator, fluids, and intravenous drugs kept her going while the rest of her body recovered. The next day, the doctors were able to remove her lines and tubes, and the day after that, she was sitting up in bed, ready to go home. Thank you.